Greetings, students of World History 2. Mr. Deegan here once again for another edition of VidNotes videos. Today we're going to continue our study of Unit 4, the Era of Revolutions. Today we're going to be talking about Lesson 4, and in Lesson 4 we travel to England to talk about the English Civil War and England's Glorious Revolution. And as a result of that civil war, you see King Charles I's head being chopped off. It's the first time a king in Europe has his head chopped off by his own people. More about that in a minute. We start with our guiding question, and it is, do citizens in a country like absolutism? Let's remember what absolutism is. Absolutism is a political theory that argues that one person, one person should hold all power. And isn't that a great thing? After all, if one person is making all the decisions in a country, you can sit at home and relax, watch TV, or you can hang out with your friends, and that one person does the work for you. That sounds pretty good. Well, as a preview, the people of England didn't think that sounded great. They wanted to develop their own rights. And this lesson is going to talk about the development of the rights of Englishmen. You're going to be introduced to Oliver Cromwell, who takes over after King Charles I is executed. You're then going to see the restoration of Charles II. Monarchy returns to Great Britain after Oliver Cromwell's rule is bad. And you're going to see throughout the course of the Civil War, political parties, aka factions, develop. The Cavaliers siding with the king and the Roundheads siding with Parliament. And you're going to see the Glorious Revolution, where King William and Queen Mary agree to share power with Parliament. Before the English Civil War and the Glorious Revolution, English citizens already had some rights. And these three areas show they did have rights. The Magna Carta. This was an English document dating back to 1215, which forced the king to consult his nobles before Britain could tax citizens or go to war. The second thing that gave English people rights was the idea of common law. There were a set of laws which were based on the decisions of judges, not on kings or politicians. Kings or politicians tend not to be as fair as judges. And the third thing that gave English citizens some rights was trial by jury. Decisions were made by a jury and then enforced by a judge. Let's review. You have the Magna Carta, you had English citizens with rights, but in the 1600s in Europe, you also had absolute monarchies. Let's think back to France and Russia. Louis XIV was absolutely ruling France, and Peter the Great was taking complete control of Russia. How were they doing this? Well, they were centralizing their power to their benefit. And they were ruling by claiming divine right. They were claiming that God was speaking directly to them and helping them make decisions as they ruled. And in England, in the 1600s, King Charles I takes the throne in 1625, and he says that he is an absolute monarch. There is King Charles I with his goatee and his royal gear. You see his crown to show his royal power. And he is the leader of Great Britain. Who is Charles I? Let's give a little background here. Putting Charles I in perspective. We remember in England, Queen Elizabeth I, the daughter of Henry VIII. After she died, James I takes the throne. And when he dies in 1625, Charles I was his surviving son. So Charles I then takes the throne. And we also have to think about Parliament. Who is Parliament in England? They're a council of the advisors to the king. And here are the members of Parliament in their room. And They were originally called the House of Commons. They were elected by the people, and their power became permanent by the Magna Carta, which we said was written in 1215. Before raising taxes, the King of England had to gain the consent or the agreement of Parliament. So Parliament was a check on the king's power. Well, then comes Charles I. He sees no need for Parliament's approval. He says he answers to God only, not to this political group, because he's claiming he's an absolute monarch. And here is a quote that shows his mindset of leadership. Kings are not bound to give an account of their actions, but to God alone. So we have this battle between Charles I and Parliament, who represent the people. Charles I needs money after a while, so he actually has to work with Parliament. Charles I wants to expand the English Empire, and he gets involved in wars with France and other European powers. Parliament refuses to give Charles I money and refuses to say okay on these war plans. So then Charles I dissolves Parliament. In other words, he abolishes them. He says, you cannot meet anymore. Well, eventually he needs Parliament back. He needs their political power, and he's forced to sign the Petition of Right. And it says that taxes can only be raised by Parliament. It also says that in England there shall be no false imprisonment, quartering soldiers, or martial law. And Charles actually agrees to and signs the petition, but he didn't call for Parliament to meet for 10 years. And stepping back in 1629, Charles I dissolves Parliament and rules like an absolute monarch in England for 11 years. This leads to the English Civil War. From 1642 to 1651, there is a war between the supporters of Charles I, who are called the Cavaliers, much like Virginia and UVA. And on the other side of the fight, we have the supporters of Parliament. They're called the Roundheads because a lot of the Parliament members had round haircuts, round like Charlie Brown's head. King Charles I and Oliver Cromwell, who is an important and powerful voice within Parliament. So, what happens in the English Civil War? Let's take a look at this box here. Charles I flees London in fear of his life because Parliament uses their grievances to send troops. And the nation quickly divides. You have those who are pro-king, the Cavaliers, which is from the French chevalier, meaning knight. And then you have the pro-Parliament members, like I said, those called the Roundheads because of their haircuts. What happens? Charles loses and is captured by the Scottish, who are pairing up with Parliament. And the Scottish troops hand Charles I over to Parliament, and 59 judges find Charles I guilty of high treason. They say he is a tyrant, a traitor, a murderer of the people, and a public enemy. And he is beheaded. Never before had a reigning monarch faced public trial and execution in Europe. This was a big deal. And the Roundhead general, this man, Oliver Cromwell, abolishes the monarchy and he takes over England. So in 1649, Charles I is executed, and Oliver Cromwell then becomes the Lord Protector of England. He's not the king. He's the leader of the Roundheads, let's remember, which is pro-Parliament. However, what he does in England is not very parliamentary. In fact, from 1649 to 1658, Cromwell rules a lot like a dictator. He returns England to strict Puritan morals. Puritans are a Protestant Christian group, and Cromwell, dissolves Parliament, just like King Charles I. Sounds an awful lot like a monarchy. And his strict Puritan morals said that there was no dancing, no theater, no taverns, no gambling, no Christmas gifts. Why? Because Cromwell said they were too sinful. He said to the people of England, "You will be a blessing to the nation, so you will act according to my rules and laws." And an example of how strict Cromwell was that he organized the burning of the Globe Theatre in England. The Globe Theatre was where William Shakespeare had a lot of his plays. So this was a symbol of how strict Cromwell had become. Not liking the theater, not liking the arts, because it was sinful. Well, after Cromwell, we have a restoration of the monarchy. In 1660, there is the restoration or the bringing back of Charles II, who is the son of Charles I. And English citizens are very happy at this change because he brings back all of the arts and entertainment that Oliver Cromwell had taken out of English society. And we have, after Charles II, the Glorious Revolution. So after Charles dies, we have James becoming the king. And James II is a very Catholic man, and he appoints many Catholics to high-ranking positions in England. The Parliament protests this. After all, many of them are Protestant. And James then dissolves Parliament as well. James, however, had a son who was Catholic and had an older daughter who was Protestant named Mary. And Mary was the wife of William of Orange. And Parliament did something very tricky. They invited William to overthrow the King of England, William, who is the husband of Mary. And James has to flee from England, fearing for his life. And therefore, there is a bloodless revolution, aka the Glorious Revolution, because it's peaceful. And William and Mary take power in England. And they agree to share their power. Here's Mary, here's William, and they're sharing power with Parliament. And they agree to sign the English Bill of Rights, which guarantees rights to the English people. So in 1689, these two, who William and Mary, the college in Virginia, are named after, they sign the English Bill of Rights, and Parliament becomes more powerful, and there is a constitutional or limited monarchy now in England. What is a constitutional or limited monarchy? Well, it is not an absolute monarchy, much like we saw in France with Louis XIV, the Sun King, who has his Palace of Versailles. Instead, a limited monarchy, a constitutional monarchy, is one in which power is shared between the king and queen and Parliament. Shared power. The English Bill of Rights had an influence on other countries, including America. So how did the English Bill of Rights influence the American Bill of Rights? Well, the English Bill of Rights listed freedom of speech, just like America's Bill of Rights. It listed freedom of petition, the right to petition your government and complain about the things your government is doing. The English Bill of Rights also had no cruel punishments for criminals, just like the American Bill of Rights. So our founding fathers in the United States borrowed a lot of ideas from England's Bill of Rights. We are almost done, World History 2 students. We have but the summary questions remaining. At this time, please fill out those questions. And a preview of next lesson, we talk about art and literature and music during the time of the Enlightenment. Until then, this is Mr. Deegan, signing off.